Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a campfire. Roughly 300,000 years ago. You smell like animal fat and smoke, and you haven't bathed since the concept of bathing was invented, which it hasn't been yet. Someone in your group killed a large animal today. It's sitting over there. Everyone knows the rule. The person who made the kill gets the first and largest portion. That is the deal. That has always been the deal. But here's the thing. You didn't kill it. You were on the other side of the ridge, picking berries and actively hiding from a hyena. You contributed absolutely nothing to that kill. And yet, when the group gathers around that fire, you gesture confidently toward the carcass. You make a sound. You adopt an expression that says, "Yes, I did that. This was me." And it works. Nobody questions you. The meat gets divided. You eat well tonight. Congratulations. You just pulled off something that, until very recently, scientists assumed was uniquely modern. Something that requires a sophisticated level of brain power. Something that, and this is the part that should make you deeply uncomfortable, you are almost certainly still doing on a fairly regular basis. You lied. Now, here's what's funny about that. Not funny ha-ha. Funny in the way that makes you stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m. thinking about your own behavior. The lie you just told around that prehistoric campfire was probably not the first lie ever told by something in your evolutionary family. Not even close. Because lying, as it turns out, doesn't begin with humans. It doesn't begin with language. It doesn't begin with our genus. The roots of deception go back much further than any of that. And the real question isn't when humans first started lying. The real question is what lying tells us about when intelligence actually began, and how deep the connection runs between the ability to deceive and the ability to think at all. This goes back further than you want it to. And the answer involves an animal you didn't expect. Here's what nobody tells you about lying. We treat deception like it's a bug in the human moral operating system, a flaw, an error code. The thing you do when you're bad, when you're scared, when you're selfish or cowardly or just trying to get more meat than you deserve. But that framing is completely wrong. Lying isn't a moral failure. It is a cognitive achievement. Think about what a lie actually requires. And I don't mean a reflex. Not the way a squid changes color to hide from a predator. That's camouflage. That's a body doing an automatic body thing. A real lie, a social deception, is something categorically different. To lie, you need to understand that other people have minds. Not just bodies, not just behaviors, but inner mental states, beliefs, expectations, a version of reality that lives inside their head and is entirely separate from what's in yours. To lie, you need to predict what someone else currently believes, then construct a false version of reality, then deliver that false version convincingly enough that they update their belief to match your fabricated one. And then, crucially, you need to hold two things in your head at the same time: the true version of events and the false version you've inserted into their mind, without mixing them up. That is a staggering amount of cognitive work for something we do casually, daily, without thinking. It has a name. It's called theory of mind. The ability to understand that other beings have mental states that are separate from your own, that someone else can be wrong about something you're right about, that you can know something they don't, and that you can use that gap. For a long time, scientists believed theory of mind was uniquely human. They were wrong. Let's get specific about what theory of mind looks like in practice. In human children, it clicks into place somewhere between ages 3 and 5. There's a classic test for this. You show a child that a candy box actually contains pencils. Then you ask them, what will the next child think is inside? Before theory of mind develops, a child will say pencils, because they know what's inside, and they can't yet separate their knowledge from someone else's. After theory of mind develops, they'll say candy. They understand that someone else holds a false belief, and they can model it accurately without sharing it. Before that shift happens, kids are genuinely terrible liars. Not because they lack the motivation to deceive, they absolutely try, but because they lack the machinery. They'll tell you they didn't eat the cookie while actively holding the cookie. They cannot model your beliefs as separate from reality. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. For decades, theory of mind was treated as the cognitive Rubicon, the feature that placed humans in a completely different category from every other animal. The proof that human minds were not just more complex than other animals, but fundamentally different in kind. And then, researchers started looking more carefully at what chimpanzees were doing. In the 1970s, primatologist David Premack designed a series of experiments to test whether chimpanzees could understand the intentions and beliefs of others. The results were complicated. They led to more experiments, more researchers, more carefully controlled setups. And the more they looked, the more they found the same thing. Chimps track what other individuals know and don't know. They behave differently depending on who is watching and what that observer is aware of. They make strategic decisions based on the gap between their own knowledge and someone else's, which means theory of mind, in some form, is not uniquely human, which means lying, in some form, is not uniquely human either. Let's take a detour. Bear with me. This is the part where it genuinely gets strange. The cuttlefish. The cuttlefish is a small marine animal that looks like someone tried to design a squid during a high fever. 3 hearts, blue-green blood, and the most sophisticated active camouflage system ever documented in the animal kingdom. It can change both color and texture in real time, matching its surroundings so precisely that it can effectively disappear against almost any background within milliseconds. But here's the part that matters. Male cuttlefish are intensely competitive about mating. When a large, dominant male is present nearby, a smaller male faces an immediate problem. He cannot win in any kind of direct physical contest. So, what does he do? He changes the pattern on one side of his body to resemble a female. He broadcasts a false signal, a female appearance, toward the dominant male, convincing him there's no rival to worry about. And simultaneously, on the other side of his body, he continues displaying a male courtship pattern toward the female he's actually trying to mate with. He is running 2 separate, contradictory signals at the same time, one false, one true, aimed at 2 different audiences. Is that conscious deception? Almost certainly not in the way we experience conscious thought, but it is functional deception. Behavior that produces a false belief in another individual, and the deceiver benefits directly from it. That is the structural architecture of a lie, with or without conscious intent behind it. The orchid mantis. The orchid mantis is an insect that has evolved to look almost indistinguishable from a flower. It positions itself among flowering plants and waits. Pollinators, bees, flies, other insects drawn by the expectation of nectar approach it, register it as a flower, and land. The mantis eats them. But here's the twist that makes this more than camouflage. Research published in the journal Current Biology found that the orchid mantis doesn't just hide among flowers, it actively outcompetes them. It draws in more pollinators than the actual flowers around it do. The mimicry has become so precise, so perfected, that the counterfeit beats the original. That's not hiding. That's a lure. A constructed false signal, refined over evolutionary time, designed to manipulate the behavior of another species. The deception isn't defensive. It's predatory. The ravens. Ravens are a different problem entirely, and they are not giving you the benefit of the doubt. Ravens cache food. They hide it in specific locations and return to eat it later, a sophisticated memory behavior on its own. But here's where it gets interesting. Ravens have noticed that other ravens watch them hide food, and they don't like it. So when a raven suspects it's being observed while caching, it will sometimes perform what researchers call a false cache. It goes through the entire motion, lands, digs, or pecks at the ground, appears to bury something, covers the spot carefully, and leaves nothing there. The performance is convincing. The location is empty. The observer, if it follows up, finds nothing. The actual food is hidden somewhere else entirely. But here's the detail that separates this from instinct. Ravens only perform false caches when they have personally stolen food from another raven before. If a raven has never been a thief, it doesn't display this behavior. It's not a default. It's a learned strategic response built on self-knowledge. They know thieves exist because they are one, and they apply that knowledge to protect themselves. Theory of mind. In a bird. The chimpanzees. And then there are chimps, who are To put it plainly, exhausting to study, because they seem to understand social dynamics better than some people I've met. Field researchers have documented chimpanzees emitting food calls in situations where no food is present, to redirect the group, to create movement and opportunity that benefits the caller. They've documented subordinate males physically concealing signs of arousal from dominant males, literally repositioning, turning away, because they understand that visible interest in a female will provoke immediate intervention from a dominant individual who is watching. They've documented individuals leading competitors deliberately away from food sources, then doubling back to collect the food alone. The misdirection is intentional. The return is strategic. The understanding of what the competitor knows and doesn't know is the engine of the whole operation. That is not reflexive behavior. That is not camouflage. That is modeling another individual's mind, understanding what they believe, predicting what they'll do with that belief, and deliberately inserting false information into the system to change the outcome. That is lying. So if chimpanzees can deceive, and ravens can model other minds, and a cuttlefish can run a live, split-audience manipulation, where does this capacity appear specifically in the human lineage? This is where the fossil record becomes genuinely frustrating, because you cannot find a lie in a bone. You cannot carbon date a false impression. Deception itself doesn't fossilize. The evidence has to come from indirect markers: brain anatomy, inferred group size, social complexity, and what we can extrapolate from the behavior of our closest living relatives. Here's what we can say. The brain regions most heavily involved in producing and managing deception, the prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, impulse control, and future projection, the temporal parietal junction, which processes the distinction between self and other, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict and cost, all began expanding significantly in the human lineage somewhere around 2 to 3 million years ago. This is not a coincidence. This is approximately when Homo habilis appeared, when our ancestors were living in larger, more complex social groups, when maintaining alliances, tracking reputations, reading intentions, and managing social standing became critical survival tasks. Not secondary concerns, but core survival competencies. Primatologist Robin Dunbar proposed what's now called the social brain hypothesis, the idea that primate brains didn't expand primarily to solve physical problems, like navigating terrain or identifying food sources. They expanded to navigate each other, to track the web of relationships, reputations, alliances, betrayals, and shifting coalitions that made up the social environment of a group-living primate. And in that environment, the individual who could model other minds, who could predict what someone else believed, identify what they didn't know, and deliberately insert false information into that gap, had an enormous competitive advantage. They got more resources. They formed more stable alliances. They survived crises that required social maneuvering. They reproduced more successfully. Their descendants inherited the same neural architecture, which means that the brain capable of deception was selected for. It was rewarded generation after generation across hundreds of thousands of years. Deception wasn't a side effect of intelligence. It was one of the engines that built it. Now, here is where I have to stop and tell you something that might reorder everything you think you know about language. We assume language came first, that human ancestors learned to communicate, to share information, coordinate hunts, build culture, transmit knowledge across generations, and that lying emerged later as a corruption of that system, a misuse of an honest tool. But a growing number of researchers in evolutionary linguistics are making a very different argument. What if deception came first? Not lying in the full verbal sense, but strategic social deception. The intentional manipulation of another individual's beliefs through false signals. The neural architecture to model another mind and insert false information into it. What if that capacity was in place before language ever emerged? And what if language, when it eventually appeared, was partly shaped, partly built by brains that were already sophisticated deceivers? Think about what language actually is from a purely functional standpoint. It is the most powerful information sharing system ever developed by any species on this planet. With language, you can transmit extraordinarily detailed, complex, abstract information across time and space. You can coordinate behavior at scales no other species can match. But here is the other thing language lets you do. It lets you say things that are not true, efficiently, convincingly, in enormous detail. With plausible deniability, you can construct entirely false realities with words in a way that no physical gesture or behavioral signal can match for precision and scale. Language is equally, perhaps primarily, a tool for information manipulation. If our hominid ancestors were already building sophisticated deception capabilities before language emerged, and the primate and neural evidence strongly suggests they were, then language didn't introduce the lie into human social life, it supercharged it. We may have developed complex language partly because it was an extraordinarily powerful instrument for something we were already doing, getting other minds to believe things that weren't true. The lie didn't corrupt language. The lie may have helped build it. Sit with that for a moment, because it means that every time you open your mouth to tell the truth, you're using a tool that was partly forged in deception. The same system, the same neural wiring, the same evolutionary inheritance. Now here's where it gets dark. Because deception has never operated in a vacuum. Every social group that has ever existed on this planet has been under simultaneous evolutionary pressure to produce better deceivers and to catch them. This is an arms race, and it has been running for millions of years. The logic is straightforward. If your group cannot detect cheating, it gets exploited. The individual who takes more than they contribute, who signals false alliances, lies about resources, performs cooperation while extracting benefit without reciprocating, that individual undermines the cooperative structure that makes group living valuable in the first place. A community full of undetected cheaters stops functioning, and then it collapses. So alongside the evolution of deception, there is an entire parallel evolution of detection. Humans are remarkably, though imperfectly, attuned to social signals that something is wrong. Micro-expressions that flash across a face in less than a fifth of a second. Subtle inconsistencies between what someone says and what their body communicates. Mismatches between claimed knowledge and demonstrated knowledge. We notice these things. Not always consciously, not always accurately, but reliably enough that cheaters face meaningful risk. And we gossip. Almost universally across all human cultures, gossip is one of the primary functions of social language. This gets dismissed as trivial. It isn't! Gossip, as Dunbar pointed out, is fundamentally a reputation tracking system. Who can be trusted? Who lied before? Who took more than their share? Who said one thing to one person and something contradictory to another? Gossip is the social immune system, distributed intelligence about who is safe to cooperate with. In early human groups, the social consequence of being caught in a significant deception was not embarrassment. It was exile. And exile in the Pleistocene, across the roughly 2.6 million year span that covers most of human evolutionary history, was not a minor inconvenience. You could not survive alone on the Pleistocene landscape. The group provided everything: warmth through collective shelter, defense against predators too large to face solo, food distribution during scarcity, care during illness and injury, protection for children who needed years of survival before they could fend for themselves. Being expelled from the group was, in many circumstances, a death sentence delivered without the drama of violence. So the calculus of lying became, at its core, a survival calculation. Is the benefit of this false signal, the extra resources, the gained alliance, the avoided confrontation, large enough to justify the risk of being caught? And what does being caught cost me? Not in embarrassment, in life expectancy. That calculation didn't disappear when human life became safer. It didn't stop running when we built cities, legal systems, HR departments, or social media profiles. It is embedded in your threat detection architecture. It operates in you every time you decide what to tell someone and what to leave out. Every time you slightly reshape a story for your audience. Every time you say you're fine when you're measurably not fine. Your ancestors built this system across millions of years of high-stakes social navigation. You inherited it fully assembled. Here's the part where you recognize yourself. You have already lied today. Statistically, and researchers have actually measured this, humans tell somewhere between 1 and 2 lies per day on average. The number climbs in high-stakes social situations. The majority are what we'd loosely call white lies. Small social adjustments, lubricants for the machinery of daily interaction. But the number is never 0, and your brain knows exactly when you're doing it. Neuroimaging studies, research that watches which parts of the brain activate during specific tasks, consistently show that the neural cost of lying is measurably higher than the cost of telling the truth. Your prefrontal cortex works harder. Additional cognitive resources are recruited. Monitoring systems engage that sit completely dormant during honest statements. Lying is expensive. Not morally, cognitively. Your brain treats deception as a more demanding computation than truth-telling. And this is interesting for a specific reason. It suggests that honesty might actually be the path of least resistance, the lower-cost default your brain runs on, and deception is the costly override, the resource-intensive alternative you reach for when the social situation seems to demand it. And yet, you reach for it. Every day. We all do. Not because we're bad people, because we're social ones. Because we live in complex environments with competing interests, relationships we value, impressions we're managing, and information we've calculated, consciously or not, is better withheld right now. Because the social pressures that generated this behavior in the first place never went away. They changed their surface appearance. That's all. The campfire became the open plan office. The hunting party became the group project. The dominant male who would take your meat became the manager who will take your credit. The stakes are usually lower now. The consequences of being caught are usually survivable, but the circuitry is identical. You are running a behavioral system that was shaped across millions of years of social evolution under genuinely mortal pressure. You didn't design it. You didn't choose it. You inherited it from ancestors who survived precisely because they were sophisticated enough, socially intelligent enough, to know when to be honest, and when, at calculated risk, not to be. So here is the question you're left with. If deception is this old, older than language, older than Homo sapiens, built into the deepest architecture of social intelligence itself, what does that actually mean for honesty? We've constructed enormous moral frameworks around the idea that honesty is the right way to be. Religious systems, legal systems, philosophical traditions across radically different cultures all converge on the same basic instruction: tell the truth. Immanuel Kant argued that lying was categorically wrong under all circumstances, that if everyone deceived, the very concept of communication would collapse, and the lie would defeat itself. And he wasn't wrong about that. He just described, from the top down philosophically, a system that evolution had already built from the bottom up. Because here's what natural selection figured out long before any philosopher did. A group where deception is completely unchecked collapses. Trust is not a luxury or a nicety. It is structural. It is load-bearing. Cooperation, the capacity that made humans the most successful large animal on this planet, requires a baseline level of honest information exchange to function. Without it, the collective intelligence that makes a group more than the sum of its parts simply stops working. And then the group stops working. And so we built a moral architecture around the strategic suppression of a capacity that evolution had spent millions of years carefully refining. Not because the capacity is evil, but because the capacity, left completely unchecked, destroys the cooperative infrastructure that keeps everyone alive, including the person doing the deceiving. Maybe morality isn't the suppression of our animal nature. Maybe it's the negotiation with it. Maybe the fact that humans constructed elaborate social and moral codes around truth-telling and largely try to follow them isn't proof that lying is aberrant. It's proof that we're sophisticated enough to understand the full systemic cost of our own capabilities, that we can model the long game, that we can sacrifice the short-term benefit of the lie for the long-term stability of being trusted. Your ancestors lied their way into complexity, into language, into larger groups with more resources, more collective knowledge, more protection against a world that was genuinely trying to kill them. And then they turned around and tried, imperfectly, inconsistently, with exceptions carved out for themselves and stricter standards applied to others, to negotiate their way towards something that looked like honesty. Because they figured out what every child eventually learns and every adult sometimes forgets. The lie gets you more meat tonight, but the truth is what keeps you at the fire. Here's what I want you to think about. The last lie you told. Not a dramatic one, just a regular, everyday social lie. Maybe you said you were almost there when you hadn't left yet. Maybe you said the food was great. Maybe you said you were fine. Maybe you said you already sent the email. Think about why you told it. Not the excuse you'd give if someone asked, the real reason. What were you protecting? What were you avoiding? What would the honest version have cost you? In someone's perception of you? In the relationship? In the awkwardness that would have followed? Drop it in the comments. Not the lie itself, just the why. Because if you look at that reasoning clearly, really look at it, it will map almost exactly onto the calculation a hominid was running around a fire 2 million years ago. Same variables, same social stakes, same fear of what honesty might cost you. We haven't changed as much as we like to think.